Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows, Avengers Endgame, and Game of Thrones Season 8, particularly Episodes 1 and 2 of the season, all function as a nostalgic, introspective look back on the respective series, returning to iconic locations and reprising iconic characters, reminding the audience of iconic moments to reward them for sticking with the story for so long. Both parts of the Deathly Hallows feature locations, characters, objects, and imagery that harkens back to previous entries in the series. Avengers Endgame literally revisits the events of past films through the time heist its plot is built around. Game of Thrones Season 8's first 2 episodes are set almost entirely in Winterfell, where the Stark story began all the way back in Season 1, and there's this moment following a peasant child climbing to get a better view of Jon and Dany returning to Winterfell that very deliberately calls back to an iconic moment from the first episode. Now, I wouldn't necessarily say that it's a necessity to revisit locations, reprise characters, and emulate imagery from previous entries in a series when constructing a finale story. Ultimately, all that it boils down to is a kind of loaded nostalgia. But in terms of making an ending satisfying, it's also an effective shortcut to validating audience investment in the earlier entries in the story and demonstrating thematic and narrative cohesion. It can create a sense of consequentialism in the story, or show how the events of the story have changed the story world. The writer still has to construct a new plot within which these nostalgic beats can fit seamlessly, and constructing an entirely new plot that doesn't look back on the narrative tapestry created by the previous entries will at least remove the risk of being too self-derivative. The audience will take the opportunity presented by the journey's end to fondly look back on earlier entries in the series without the writer's assistance. However, facilitating that nostalgia within the finale story itself is another means of validating the audience's investment in the story, as well as creating a satisfying symmetry to your story. To quote the great scholar Wikipedia in their comprehensive article titled Hero's Journey, in narratology and comparative mythology, the monomyth, or the hero's journey, is the common template of a broad category of tales and lore that involves a hero who goes on an adventure and in a decisive crisis wins a victory and then comes home changed or transformed. Popularized by Joseph Campbell, who was influenced by Carl Jung's view of myth. In his 1949 work The Hero with a Thousand Faces, Campbell described the basic narrative pattern as follows. A hero ventures forth from the world of common day into a region of supernatural wonder. Fabulous forces are there encountered, and a decisive victory is won. The hero comes back from this mysterious adventure with the power to bestow boons on his fellow man. Thanks, Wiki, I couldn't have said it better myself. Now, this isn't to say that all stories should use or do use the monomyth template, though I would suggest that there's something fundamentally compelling and satisfying about the way that the structure composes a story, and that a satisfying story, particularly those concerned with themes of good versus evil, or are composed in a way that emulates or adheres to epic or mythic form, should aim to echo, adhere to, or comment on the monomyth structure. The monomyth wasn't intended to be a prescriptive story structure formula like Save the Cat, but was more a philosophical exercise in understanding the commonalities in the way we tell stories. Common imagery, common character archetypes, common story structure, common ideas. Campbell was interested in the overarching story of humanity, and how myth and storytelling plays its part in helping us understand our own place in the universe. Now, if we boil the monomyth down to its simplest form, down to 2 words, I would argue that it's about symbiotic change. How the hero is changed by the journey, and how the story world is changed by the hero. All this to say, another purpose of revisiting locations, reprising characters, and emulating imagery of previous entries in the finale entry is to demonstrate that change. How the story world has changed since the beginning of the journey, how the characters have changed as a result of the journey, how the circumstances have changed since the first instance of the imagery being evoked. Another structure worth discussing is chiastic or ring structure. Chiastic structure fits into the monomyth structure as both are cyclical by design, though chiastic structure uses that structural circle to create symmetry in the storytelling. It's also commonly found in myths and legends, like the monomyth. George Lucas famously has structured the Star Wars saga using chiastic structure, commenting in a behind-the-scenes look at The Phantom Menace that...
And that with Anakin, kind of duplicating the Luke Skywalker role, but you see the echo of where it all is going to go. And instead of destroying the Death Star, he destroys the ship that controls the robots. Again, it's like poetry, so if they rhyme, every stanza kind of rhymes with the last one.
Chiastic structure is especially satisfying in a multi-part story because each entry in the story can be used to echo and comment on the previous entry, which creates a sort of avalanche effect in the narrative. The themes and ideas get richer the more that they are drawn on. If you do a Google search for how to end a story, this article from Boards posits that there are 6 ways to end a story. A resolved ending in which the core plot lines are resolved in a conclusive manner, an unresolved ending in which the core plot lines are left unresolved, an ambiguous ending in which either the core plot lines are resolved but in an inconclusive or ambiguous manner, or the core plot lines are resolved but the ending raises another question that isn't resolved within the story, an unexpected or twist ending in which a surprise reveal of information significantly recontextualizes the story, a full circle ending in which the end of the story comes back to the place or circumstance with which the story began, and an epilogue ending in which a resolution is followed by a flash forward to show where the characters ended up after the resolution. I would add that there's definitely some room for overlap in these categories. Full circle endings and epilogue endings typically follow a resolved ending, but not every resolved ending is a full circle or epilogue ending. Multi-part stories typically have resolved endings, which may or may not come full circle and may or may not include an epilogue. The Harry Potter series ends with a resolved full circle epilogue ending, set 19 years after the resolution of the story, with the main characters seeing their children off to Hogwarts at the train platform. Avengers Endgame ends with a resolved ending that comes full circle for Captain America's character, returning to the past to finally have his dance with Peggy that he promised all the way back at the beginning of his arc.
Maggie? You're gonna need a rain check on that dance.
Game of Thrones ends with a resolved ending, albeit an unintentionally unsatisfying and illogical one, and an epilogue showing where all the Starks end up. Multi-part stories typically reject unresolved endings and ambiguous endings because if we look again at the monomyth structure that they can typically be compared to, Campbell states that a decisive victory must be won. The monomyth leaves no room for ambiguity in the resolution, and given that many of these multi-part epics with mythic stylings tend to draw from the monomyth, it's unsurprising that they tend not to leave things open-ended. Approaching writing the final entry in a multi-part story requires looking back on the previous entries for any unresolved story threads or character arcs, as well as considering important locations to revisit, characters to reprise, and iconic imagery from previous entries to invoke, to validate what the audience thinks is important, or even to retroactively make an earlier part of the story more significant on rewatch, to make the story more symmetrical in its construction, to invoke positive nostalgia for early entries in the series, and to land on an ending that best demonstrates the symbiotic change that occurs within the hero and within the story world.